So, joy. Seems like an odd choice of topic for a Sunday when we traditionally pause to remember and honor those whose lives were cut tragically short in service to their country. A time when we celebrate and mourn young men and women who were asked to kill and die for a cause or causes that may or may not have been worthy of such incredible sacrifice. Is there not a better Sunday to consider joy? And my answer to that is no. There is no better Sunday to consider joy. Most of us in this room have in some way been touched by the horror of war, the death and carnage that war always brings. War steals our loved ones by death, dismemberment, or psychological trauma. War takes from us our sons and our daughters, our fathers and mothers, our sisters and brothers, either wholly or, as Chris alluded to, in pieces. War is perhaps the darkest, most frightening invention of the human heart, which is why there is no better Sunday to consider joy. Our worship, and more than just the worship of a Sunday morning, I'm talking about all church life, the life of sacred living, all of our collective worship, I believe, is a celebration of life, and that is all life, both the light and the dark, and all the twilight shadows that fall between. Church is where we come to celebrate and commemorate the birth of our children, the place we come to exchange and celebrate vows of matrimony when we find that someone to love for the rest of our days. It's where we come to say our last goodbyes as we lay each other to final rest. Worship is a holy celebration of every aspect of life and living. And we all know that life is a roller coaster filled with transcendent, ecstatic heights and bitter, soul-jarring depths. If this is in fact life, then I see no reason why a celebration of life cannot or should not consider and commemorate both the heights and depths in the same sphere of time and space. Many of you here are probably familiar with the name Jim Valvano. Jim Valvano was a college men's basketball coach, an exuberant, inspired, and inspiring basketball coach. Against incredible odds in 1983, he led his team to a national championship. There's some famous television footage of him following that improbable victory, running like mad around the court, arms extended, looking for someone to hug. Less than 10 years after that amazing victory, Coach Valvano was diagnosed with cancer. Only a few weeks before his death in 1993, Coach Valvano was presented with the inaugural Arthur Ashe Courage and Humanitarian Award. At the live awards ceremony broadcast by ESPN, Coach Valvano gave an acceptance speech. Now, if YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter existed back in 1993, that speech would have gone viral. If you've never heard the entirety of that speech after the service, do yourself a favor, go and find it. During Coach Valvano's acceptance speech, a teleprompter told Coach Valvano that he had only 30 seconds left to conclude his speech. Valvano, who would fall to cancer less than 2 months later, told the entire audience, quote, "They got that screen up there flashing 30 seconds like I care about that screen. I got tumors all over my body and I'm worried about some guy going 30 seconds. The audience resoundingly approved Valvano's decision to defy the teleprompter. I was 14 years old. Phillip Baber, I was 14 years old when Coach Valvano gave that speech. And there was something in that speech that Valvano said that has stuck with me ever since, to this very day, to this very moment, as I speak to you right now. He said in that speech the following: To me, there are three things we should do every day. Number one is laugh. Number two is think. And number three is you should have your emotions moved to tears. If you laugh, you think, and you cry, that's a full day. That's a heck of a day. I wish I could say that I've been able to faithfully follow and apply Coach Valvano's advice. His advice is difficult and somewhat impractical, but often the best advice is difficult and impractical. Although Coach Valvano intended this advice to be applied by anyone and everyone for every single day, I have always thought that his advice is a perfect prescription, a perfect recipe for worship. Early on, I knew that, for me at least, the perfect worship service, whatever faith tradition it might be, is one in which you laugh, you think, and you cry. Because that's life. That's a good, full life. And good worship, especially Unitarian, Universalist worship, is a celebration of this beautiful, broken life that we all share together. So, joy. In preparing for my sermon on joy today, I read a lot of essays, I listened to several sermons, and an interesting trend I observed is that every religious essay or talk or sermon that I found about joy immediately began by drawing a distinction between joy and happiness. Every speaker, every writer, many of them brilliant, well-read, educated people, every one of them defined joy and happiness as separate constructs. And with so many brilliant people doing this, it obviously would be wise for me to follow suit, except that I don't want to. So I'm not. As a parenthetical, one of my all-time favorite quotes comes from Clara Barton. She was the founder of the American Red Cross and a Universalist. She's one of ours, but not the Unitarian. She was the second U, a Universalist. She was once quoted as saying, "I defy the tyranny of precedent." It's a good UU quote, isn't it? So you see, we UUs have a long, proud tradition of defying tradition. Anyway, I love that quote because there's at least some times when we all need to defy the tyranny of precedent, just as there are always some times we should defy the tyranny of teleprompters. But I digress. Today I will defy the tyranny of precedent by not drawing a distinction between joy and happiness. The difference is there. It's important. It's a good conversation. It's just not the conversation I want today. For my purposes this morning, joy and happiness may as well be the same thing. And I think that we then all have a basic idea of what joy is. We don't need to march out dictionaries for this question. I could ask each of you for a definition of joy. I don't think anyone in here would be stumped. The more difficult, the more interesting question is, it's not what is joy. Rather, it's what is the role of joy in the Unitarian Universalist faith? See, that question's interesting. The word joy, if you haven't noticed, it doesn't appear anywhere in our 7 principles. It doesn't appear in our 6 sources. It doesn't appear in this congregation's mission statement. It doesn't appear in the L. Griswold Williams affirmation that we recite at the end of every service. The word joy does not appear to be a particularly popular term. And frankly, that's not just the case with UUs. Usage of the word joy in English print has been in steady decline since 1800. Back in 1800, the word joy had a usage rate of approximately 0.0075%. Yes, there's math this morning. What that means is that of all the printed English words in 1800, 0.0075% of those words was the word joy. Now that, of course, seems really small, and it is, but over time, the usage rate of joy actually steadily dropped. By 1980, the usage rate for joy had dropped to less than 0.0025%. So in 1980, the word joy as a percentage of all published English words was merely a third of what it was in 1800. What does this mean? I don't know. Does this mean that people in the 1800s were 3 times more joyful than people in 1980? I've seen photographs of people from the 1800s. They don't look that joyful. The facial expression of every person I've ever seen from the 1800s appears to be a sad and bizarre mix of anger, dread, and horror. Now, I know it took like an hour for a single photograph to be taken back then because of the exposure time, but I still don't understand why anyone would want to hold that pose for any extended time. It really looks like it hurts. And of course, as a parenthetical, the extended exposure time for photographs back then is, of course, the reason there are so few selfies from the 1800s, because your arm would get sore holding the flash powder. The funny thing about the usage rate for joy is that although it steadily declined from 1800 through the 1980s, around the mid to late 1990s, it began to tick upward, and it has been steadily rising ever since. I don't know what this means either. I tried to think of important social or cultural events that coincided with the mid to late 90s that might explain this increase in usage of the word joy, and the two I came up with was one, the internet, and two, the debut of Ally McBeal. Another theory that might explain these usage rate patterns is this: joy is a traditionally Christian virtue. The Apostle Paul lists it as a fruit of the Holy Spirit in his epistle to the Galatians. So the declining usage of the term joy in English print from the 1800s to 1980 might actually be a proxy measure of the decline of Christianity's influence in the English-speaking world over the past couple of centuries. If so, then what might explain the uptick in usage in the 1990s to today? Well, perhaps this reflects the Western world's rejection of absolute secularism and materialism and commercialism that reached its zenith, or its nadir, depending upon how you look at it, in the 1980s. Perhaps people started realizing that in moving away from Christianity and organized religion more generally, they had thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Perhaps a recognition occurred that one could still live a deeply religious and spiritual existence without being tied to a rigid religious doctrine or dogma. In other words, just maybe in the 1990s, the world started becoming a little more UU. So back to the question, what is the role of joy in a post or trans-Christian world, in a post or trans-Christian religion? As a former Christian myself, I can tell you that joy was often presented to me as the reaction one should have in the face of temporal, earthly adversity and sorrow, because of the belief that one should have that there's an eternity of bliss awaiting us on the other side of death. Now that idea, or definition of joy, simply not going to work for Unitarian Universalists. Unitarian Universalism claims no kind of certainty, requires no particular belief about the nature or existence of an afterlife, so a UU understanding of joy will have to be grounded elsewhere. So I went in search of a doctrine of joy in other philosophies and other faith traditions because the Christian definition just wasn't working for me anymore. I started with the Buddhists. This was a mistake. Now, I have great respect for Buddhism. My mother is a Buddhist. Seriously, some of the most spiritual people I know in life are practicing Buddhists. But reading the Buddhist doctrine of joy, or as it is sometimes translated, piti, it just depressed the hell out of me, if I can be honest. If you want to learn about compassion, transcendence, detachment, meditation, patience, go to Buddhism. It's great. But joy is not quite their cup of Kai tea, at least from my very idiosyncratic perspective. After reading about Buddhist joy and becoming very sad in the process, I decided to go to the pagans. Because seriously, if you're going to be invited to a party by either a group of Buddhist monks or a group of pagans, which are you going to choose, you know? Can we be honest today? I love Buddhists. I went to the writings of the individual that I consider to be the greatest pagan theologian, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, to my knowledge, Nietzsche never in life claimed himself to either be a pagan or a theologian. That is simply my designation based on my study of his work. Nietzsche gets a very bad rap, He was not a nihilist. His philosophy was not melancholic. Quite the contrary. He was feverishly passionate about life. He embraced the idea of unashamed joy. Nietzsche wrote of a tragic or a Dionysian joy, also sometimes called, quote, joy in the actual. Now that title as a UU probably get your ears up. Nietzsche's idea of joy in the actual is connected to his philosophical concept of eternal recurrence. I don't have time to get into the subtleties and nuances of all of these Nietzschean terms, but in a very reductionist nutshell for this morning, Nietzsche essentially argued that the noblest human being is one who can accept and embrace the actual, the reality of the life that one has, not a hope for a hypothetical future, not a longing for a romanticized past. The actual as it is, without regret, to accept and embrace the actual with both the full measure of sorrow and the full measure of joy that it deserves. He had no interest in the philosophy of Stoicism and philosophies like it, which seek to compress the highs and lows of human experience into a more easily palatable middle ground. He reveled in the highs and he suffered in the lows. On a purely personal level, this philosophy resonates with me. As a people of faith, we must not forsake joy. As a practicing UU, I am surrounded by the most incredibly passionate, sympathetic, empathetic, well-informed people that I know. I would argue that UUs understand the injustice and suffering in this world better than most. We refuse to bury our heads in the sand. We are constantly talking about, looking at, trying to solve the suffering we see, not just in our own neighborhoods, but throughout the entire world. From human rights violations to animal rights violations to violations against Mother Earth, we have a better idea than most just how much suffering there really is in this world. And it is so easy to be swallowed up in despair. And that is why we must remember joy. Joy is an equal part of our shared human existence. There is a time and a season for both joy and sorrow. I personally keep two religious images in mind when I think of this dichotomy. In one pocket, I keep the image of the Christian cross with its depiction of grief, despair, terrible and needless suffering. In my other pocket, I keep the image of Ganesh, the rapturous, joyous, smiling, elephant-headed Hindu deity who gleefully dances upon and over obstructions. While our faith compels us to acknowledge and confront the injustice, the cruelty, the stupidity in this world and the suffering it creates, I believe that our faith also compels us to rejoice in gratitude for all that is good and beautiful as well. I would argue it is a sin to ignore either. Let us not pray that the cup of suffering may pass from us. Let us willfully take that cup and drink from it. Let us drink it to the lees. But then, let us stand up and dance. Because your joy is your greatest act of revolt and defiance against the breathtaking injustice, the stupid cruelty, the impenetrable darkness and despair that inheres in our universe. Life is a wild and grand adventure if you want it to be. The universe has blessed each of us with this life, this time and space here and now, only here and now, to explore new places, explore new people, explore new ideas. Let us with joy then, ever dancing, boldly go toward that frontier. Let us not cower in fear and weakness, clutching at a past that must and already is slipping through desperate fingers like sand through an hourglass. Let us not waste this precious time counting our regrets or worrying about a future that we simply cannot control. Let us not overlook all that is good and beautiful now, because we are too fixated on all that is, has been, or could be wrong in the world, because that is not life. That is dying. There is a time for dying. But I believe the greatest tragedy is to abandon life while you still have it, and to choose to begin dying before your time. So my charge to us all this morning is simply this: rejoice. And again I say, rejoice. Blessed be.